The haunted village night fell once again like every other evening, with the pale moonlight streaming through the window, casting strange shadows on the walls. By the fireplace, Mrs. Margaret sat comfortably in her old armchair, with young Jason, a curious boy with bright, clear eyes, by her side. The fire crackled warmly, but the air held a mysterious, eerie tension. "Would you like to hear a story like we usually do?" Mrs. Margaret asked, her eyes lighting up with joy when she saw the boy nod. "This is the tale of a haunted village called Hollow Creek." Jason straightened up, barely breathing, waiting for her words to spill forth. "Hollow Creek is no ordinary village," Mrs. Margaret began, her voice dropping to a cold whisper. "By day, it's a place like any other, with wooden houses topped with red roofs and lush green fields. But when night falls, everything changes." "Changes how, Grandma?" Jason asked, feeling a surge of anticipation rise within him. "They say that when darkness descends, ghosts from the houses emerge, wandering along the narrow streets. The village comes to life, but it's silent and terrifying. They say that travelers passing through at night often seek shelter there, but none ever return. Because in the darkness, hungry demons lie in wait," Mrs. Margaret emphasized, her eyes wide, as if to push the fear from her story into the boy's soul. Jason was silent. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the rustling leaves outside. "Have you ever seen those ghosts?" he asked quietly, his voice shrinking, as if afraid to disturb the stillness. Mrs. Margaret shook her head. "I'm not foolish enough to risk going to that village, Jason, but there was a man named Thomas." She trailed off. "What happened to him?" Jason asked, now anxious. "That night, Thomas ignored all the warnings and entered Hollow Creek. People heard blood-curdling screams echoing through the night, then silence. From that moment on, he was never seen again," Mrs. Margaret said, her voice choking slightly. A chill ran down Jason's spine. "Why won't anyone else go there, Grandma?" "Because Hollow Creek is not only haunted by demons," Mrs. Margaret whispered. "It's also a place where lost souls wander, people who never found their way back. They roam, searching for something they can never have. If anyone dares to go there, they might just become part of that terrifying world." Jason swallowed hard, feeling more afraid than ever. The village of Hollow Creek loomed in his mind like an endless nightmare. "Grandma, is it true that no one ever comes back?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Perhaps there are the brave ones, but they pay a heavy price for their curiosity," Mrs. Margaret replied, her eyes seeming to gaze into some distant, sorrowful memory. As the fire in the hearth began to fade, Jason's heart felt heavy with the image of the haunted village. He knew that in his dreams tonight, Hollow Creek would haunt him, like a ghost that would never let go. The village of Hollow Creek was once tightly knit, with houses crowded together, their bright red roofs now faded and worn. Long ago, this had been a prosperous village where people lived peacefully and worked hard. But now, only the remnants of that glorious past remained. The souls trapped in a terrible tragedy had stayed, forever burdened with an unrelenting sorrow. "This village once had a reputation," Mrs. Margaret continued her story by the fire, her eyes lighting up with memories, both painful and vivid. "The people here were kind. They lived like one big family. But one day, a band of raiders swept through, looting and slaughtering everyone. Old, young, it didn't matter, none were spared. They took the young women with them." Jason listened, his heart pounding. "Why would they do that, Grandma?" he asked, his innocent mind struggling to grasp such cruelty. "For wealth, Jason," she replied softly. "They didn't just steal the lives of the innocent, they trampled on the soul of the village itself. The spirits could never leave. They became part of the village, forever bound to their painful memories." Mrs. Margaret sighed, and now they seek vengeance on all who come close." "And what about now?" Jason asked, sensing something deeply unsettling. "Now, Hollow Creek has become a desolate place. The houses are abandoned, overgrown with wild weeds. But at night, the village seems to come alive again," Mrs. Margaret said, her voice dropping to a whisper as if afraid of being overheard. Jason swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on her. "Have you ever seen what happens at night?" he asked. "Yes," Mrs. Margaret replied, her face turning serious. "On the brightest, moonlit nights, from the high hill above you can see lanterns flickering. Those lights lure people closer. It's said that the souls awaken, and the village shines as if it were alive once more, like a grand festival." "What happens to the people who go there?" Jason whispered. "They never return," Mrs. Margaret said grimly. "Those who are curious get drawn into the darkness, and by morning, they become part of the village. There are whispers that if anyone dares step foot in Hollow Creek, they'll be entranced by those spirits, and the price they'll pay is their own soul. Remember this, Jason. Hollow Creek is no place for the faint of heart. Those who seek to explore it must confront their deepest fears," Mrs. Margaret said, her eyes gleaming with the wisdom of age. "Thomas was a young man," she began, "who lived in a far-off land, and his journey that day led him to a place he could never have imagined. As the evening grew darker, shadows of trees stretched long across the narrow path that led him into a remote village. From a distance, he saw bright, radiant lights, twinkling as if beckoning him, stirring a powerful sense of curiosity deep inside him. Maybe I should go there, Thomas thought to himself, deciding to grab his backpack and continue walking. He was looking for a place to stay for the night, and perhaps a little unexpected adventure wouldn't be so bad. As he approached the village, the sight before him was one he would never forget. Lanterns glowed brilliantly, casting an eerie light that mingled with strange sounds from afar. Villagers hurried about, dressed in traditional clothing, but something was off. They didn't seem fully real. Their forms were blurry, like spirits, giving Thomas a deep sense of unease. At the village gate, he stopped and watched. There was something both inviting and mysterious in the air. The faint, ghostly faces that moved around made him feel like he was stepping into another world, one where time itself had stopped. After a moment of hesitation, Thomas decided to blend into the crowd, despite the growing apprehension in his chest. Once inside, the atmosphere became more alive than ever. He heard laughter, music playing, and the smell of food filled the air. His stomach growled in hunger, leading him to a small noodle stand nearby. Eager for a warm meal, he sat down, waiting for a hot bowl of noodles after his long day of travel. As soon as he entered, he felt the warmth of crackling fires, smoke rising into the night sky. The server brought out a steaming bowl of noodles, the enticing aroma filling his senses. Thomas thanked them hurriedly, unable to wait any longer to dig in. But as soon as he picked up the bowl, a chill ran down his spine. Smoke rose thickly, but the bowl itself wasn't warm at all. Doubt filled his mind as he rubbed his eyes, wondering if he had somehow been mistaken. Yet when he lifted a spoonful of noodles to his mouth, something felt wrong. The noodles wriggled and squirmed as if they were alive. Terrified, he dropped the spoon, his eyes widening in disbelief at what he saw. "There! Worms!" he gasped in horror. The bowl was crawling with black, slimy worms, writhing among dried leaves and floating in a thick, black broth. Thomas recoiled, no longer able to keep his composure, knocking the bowl to the ground. The worms spilled out in all directions, sending a shiver down his spine. What kind of hellish place is this? Thomas thought in a panic. He realized that the village wasn't just filled with sparkling lights, but harbored dark secrets not everyone could escape. Before he could gather his thoughts, he noticed the ghostly eyes of the villagers in the noodle shop turning toward him, as if they were waiting for something. And Thomas's nightmare had only just begun. All the eyes in the village turned toward Thomas, making him feel as if he were trapped in a living nightmare. The faces of the villagers began to melt, like peeling layers of tar, creating grotesque images that chilled him to the core. Cold sweat dripped down his forehead as overwhelming fear took over his mind. Without another thought, Thomas bolted, running frantically as eerie laughter echoed around him. Strangely, no matter how fast he ran, he felt as though he was spinning in circles, trapped in a maze with no way out. The path ahead kept vanishing, twisting and turning into dead ends, leading him deeper into a shadowy world. The village gate, which he had hoped would be his escape, was nowhere to be found. Instead, cold stone walls covered in damp green moss seemed to close in on him, blocking every path he tried to take. As he ran, Thomas began to hear whispers, faint and ghostly, like a chorus of sorrowful souls. They seemed to be calling his name, pulling him into a realm he could not refuse. Panic swelled inside him as he sensed something following him. Each step was light yet chilling. It was as if an invisible hand were brushing against his back, urging him to run faster. Finally, Thomas came to a stop by an enormous ancient tree, gasping for breath. The tree loomed over him like a living spirit, its dry roots clawing at the ground like fingers reaching out to grab him. He turned around, and the villagers were still there, watching him with hollow eyes, reflecting the pain and suffering they had endured. Their faces no longer resembled humans, but had morphed into terrifying figures, blurring the line between people and haunted souls. "Don't run!" A voice cut through the eerie silence, soft but commanding. Thomas turned to see an elderly woman with long, flowing hair. The old woman gently placed her hand on his shoulder, reassuring him. "Young man, don't run anymore. Follow me and I'll help you," she said. Her words were calm but filled with authority, bringing a strange sense of peace to Thomas. With no other choice, he decided to follow her. Despite the doubt and fear still gnawing at him, he knew he couldn't go back down the path he had come from. It led nowhere but deeper into the haunting grip of the cursed village. The old woman walked slowly ahead, and Thomas cautiously followed. As they went on, the village behind them began to fade into the shadows, its once twinkling lights becoming faint and distant. His legs trembled, but he kept walking, step by step, behind the old woman. In her presence, he felt just a little bit safer, even though his heart was still pounding with fear. After walking for a while, Thomas noticed a small stream winding its way through the forest, the gentle sound of water trickling like a peaceful melody amidst the desolation. Next to the stream stood a modest, tidy cottage, partially hidden behind a large tree. A faint glow of oil lamp light flickered from its window, giving the scene a sense of calm, starkly different from the haunting atmosphere of the village he had just escaped. "Come on in, don't worry," the old woman invited as they neared the door. "I live here with my granddaughter, and we'll take care of you." Thomas entered the small cottage, still feeling a bit disoriented, but the exhaustion and hunger had overpowered his worries. The old woman quickly introduced herself. "This is Emily, my granddaughter. She'll get you some food. I know you must be starving and that you've been through something terrifying." Emily, the old woman's granddaughter, emerged from the kitchen, carrying a steaming plate of food for Thomas. She was a young woman, perhaps in her late teens or early 20s, with a delicate face and a gentle smile. The moment Thomas saw Emily, his heart raced. She had an elegant yet captivating beauty that made it impossible for him to look away. "Would you like some tea?" Emily asked softly, her voice calming Thomas even more. The fear from the haunted village slowly faded as he sat down and chatted with the old woman and Emily. They talked about everyday life, about the stories surrounding this land, and gradually, Thomas began to feel as if he had found a safe haven, far from any danger. Night fell, and the old woman said, "Rest here tonight. Your room is just over there. We've prepared it for you." Thomas thanked her and was shown to the bedroom. Yet even as he lay in bed, his mind couldn't stop thinking about Emily. She was too beautiful and enchanting, and her image lingered in his thoughts, making it hard for him to sleep. He found himself lost in her bright eyes and gentle smile, his heart filled with strange emotions. As he drifted into a light sleep, Thomas suddenly heard a soft knock at the door. He opened it, and to his surprise, there stood Emily, still wearing that same friendly smile. "I couldn't sleep," she whispered. "I wanted to talk to you." Overjoyed, Thomas opened the door wider. He could hardly believe that the girl he had secretly admired now stood before him, wanting to be with him in the middle of the night. They sat together, and in the dim glow of the oil lamp, they began to talk. Their conversation soon turned to lingering glances and gentle touches full of affection. Thomas's heart pounded, and what was inevitable soon came to pass. The lamp flickered out, and in the darkness, they embraced, lost in a moment of passion and romance. Thomas felt overwhelmed with happiness, silently telling himself he would never leave this place. The cursed village beyond was now a distant memory, and all he wanted was to stay with the girl who had given him an unforgettable sweet night. But then, in the dead of night, Thomas suddenly felt an icy chill. A strange coldness crept into his body, jolting him awake. He was still holding Emily tightly, but why did it feel so cold? All of a sudden, he realized something was terribly wrong. His hand, which was resting on her body, no longer felt the softness of her skin. Instead, he was touching bones. Thomas panicked and opened his eyes. In the darkness, what he saw made his heart stop. He was no longer holding Emily, but a stark white skeleton. Her skull had fallen off her body, and the remaining bones were scattered all around. He was embracing a dry skeleton beneath the large tree, surrounded by an eerie and chilling atmosphere. The cottage where the old woman and Emily once lived had vanished without a trace, as if it had never existed. Now there was only the cold wind and darkness enveloping Thomas. His face turned pale, his limbs frozen with terror. He tried to push the skeleton away, but his entire body was paralyzed, unable to move. In his ears, the wind howled with an eerie sound, as if mocking the horror he was enduring. The skull rolled down to the base of the tree, its empty eye socket seeming to stare directly at Thomas, making him feel as if he were trapped in a nightmare with no escape. He jerked awake, trembling with sheer terror. This can't be real," Thomas whispered to himself, but the images before him were too vivid to deny. Jason sat in stunned silence, his eyes wide open after listening to Mrs. Margaret recount Thomas's horrifying tale. She sat by the fireplace, the flickering flames casting shadows on her wrinkled face, making her story even more haunting. Jason swallowed hard, fear creeping into his heart as Mrs. Margaret finished in a hushed tone. He stayed there forever. Thomas's wish came true, but it wasn't the happiness he wanted. Instead of living a joyful life, he was trapped in that village, a place no one can ever leave. Jason took a deep breath, trying not to let her words haunt him. "And what about the girl, Mrs. Margaret?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Was she trapped too?" Mrs. Margaret nodded slightly, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Yes, The girl that Thomas fell for was no longer human. She had long since become a lost spirit in that village, waiting to lure men in, never to let them leave. She deceived Thomas, making him believe she was real, but it was all part of the twisted game the village plays. Jason shuddered as he listened, but his curiosity wouldn't let him stop. So what about the others? The other men who came to that village? What happened to them? Mrs. Margaret looked deeply into Jason's eyes, her aged but piercing gaze seeming to see through every thought in his mind. All the strange men who spent the night in that village disappeared. None of them ever came back. The village is like a trap, a maze with no exit. Once they enter, they're drawn into the whirlpool of spirits, sweet but deceitful promises, and in the end, they become part of the place, just like Thomas. Jason was speechless. Stories of mysterious disappearances from that eerie village had spread far and wide. No one knew exactly what happened to those who vanished, but the rumors grew stronger with time. It was said that on every full moon night, the shadows of those lost souls could be seen beneath the massive tree at the heart of the village, whispering eerie words to each other, calling for more strangers to join them in the village forever. Jason felt a chill run down his spine. Mrs. Margaret continued her story, her voice steady but as though it was stretching into a distant void. Thomas and the girl are now a ghostly couple. They live under the ancient tree, waiting for more souls. Anyone who spends the night in that village, they never wake up the next morning. No one knows exactly what happens, but once someone steps into that place, any hope of escape vanishes. Jason leaned forward, gripping the armrests of his chair, as if trying to hold on to something real. Isn't there any way out of that village? Hasn't anyone ever made it back? Mrs. Margaret sighed, her eyes filled with sorrow. No one has ever returned. Some have tried to escape, but every path leads back to the same place. The village gates, the roads leading out, all disappear. That village is like a labyrinth. Those lost there run endlessly, but in the end, they always return to where they started. And when night falls, they get drawn into the cycle of those ghostly spirits. She gazed out the window, her eyes distant. They say that only those who give up all earthly desires can escape. Perhaps that's something Thomas never understood. He wished to stay in a moment of lust clouding his mind, and that wish trapped him there forever. Jason sat in silence, absorbing Mrs. Margaret's words. The legend felt like a faint light in the dark, a haunting tale from his childhood that sent a shiver through his soul.